and you'll see this throughout, is that I'm going to jump in between some of the research projects that I've been working on over the last couple of years. It's in the context of spending. So that's a topic that I've been interested in for a while now. And I'm going to say a little bit more about why I think this is an interesting topic for psychologists to study. But really the main idea of the talk is that I want to kind of at least showcase a little bit how we can use big data in psychological research, right? So this idea that there's now all of these sources, these digital traces out there that we leave as we interact with the digital environment, whether that's your Facebook profiles, whether that's credit card spending, whether that's the sensor data that's being captured by your smartphone. It's really just kind of creates this amazing opportunity for psychologists to stay true to the promise of being a behavioral science. We always thought of ourselves as behavioral scientists and psychologists, but it was just really difficult to live up to that promise because it was just insanely time consuming, costly to follow people around and see what it is that you're actually doing on a daily basis. So now that we have this ability to collect all of these traces passively and retrospectively, I think it just creates this amazing new opportunity for psychologists to really understand behavior as it unfolds in everyday life. And I'm not the only person to suggest this. And there's this quote in The Economist a while back. It was like, the web will revolutionize social science just as the microscope and telescope transformed the natural science. And for me, this is really the essence of the world of big data, right? It gives us this window into what is it that people are doing, how is it that they're feeling, how are they potentially thinking about things as they happen in real time, how do they relate to one another and form these movements that we've seen in the last couple of years. So it's really providing a tool to answer questions that we've been interested in for a long time. And now the reason for why I got interested in the context of spending, there's many reasons. One thing is that it's just like we're all pretty terrible at it, right? So if you think about how people manage their money, there's like a lot of room for improvement. We're pretty good at spending it. We're not so good at saving it. We also oftentimes spend it pretty mindlessly, right? If you think about how much time we spend and invest in making money, we work 40 hours more to earn money, but then we often quick at spending it without really thinking about, is that something that benefits us and gives back to the lives that we want to live? So that's one of the reasons why I got interested in the space. And also because from a personality perspective, it's actually incredibly personal. If you think of spending, and this is one of my favorite papers of all times, coming out of the MIT Media Lab, which shows that it only takes 3 data points to uniquely identify a person in credit card metadata. So if I know that, say, on Friday, 7:20 a.m. in the morning, you bought a Starbucks somewhere on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, for example, and then at lunch you went to a certain restaurant in Midtown, and at night you had a cocktail downtown somewhere at 9:30, I can pretty quickly identify that this is you, because it's so unique that the signature that you leave in terms of what you're buying, where you're buying it, and when you're buying it is so unique to an individual that even if we just strip all this information of like names, date of birth, whatever it is that could potentially identify you, and we can still have a pretty good estimate of, oh, this is Matthias, this is Andrea, just by looking at these unique spending signatures. What's a little bit more interesting from a psychological point of view is these patterns in spending, right? So it's nice that I can say, okay, this is a very specific person that's attached to the spending record. But what's more interesting for psychologists is, do different patterns in spending, can they potentially reveal something about individual differences that are broader than just like one unique individual? You can imagine if you just randomly take a group of 15-year-old girls in Brooklyn, that their spending looks quite different to the spending of like a bunch of pensioners in Ohio. So one of the literatures that I'm drawing on is like Levy, who said this very early on, is like the fact that people buy things not only for what they can do, but for what they mean, right? So spending to some extent is symbolic and it's not just functional. So over the course of the last couple of years, I've been dedicating quite a bit of my research time and effort to this question of how do relatively stable personality traits, psychological characteristics, how do they relate to spending? And once we understand how these two interact, is there any way that we can use this in interventions related to spending, related to saving? So kind of zooming out a little bit, the way that I've structured this talk is essentially trying to mimic how I think about the use of big data in my own research and the way that I talk about it with my students. And it has like these three main components in which we can use the data that's out there to help us understand how individual differences relate to spending in this case. So one is as the outcome, and I think this is oftentimes what we're the most familiar with, is essentially saying, can we capture an outcome in a more objective way that doesn't necessarily rely on self-report questionnaires? So in this case, for example, the question of can the alignment between one's own personality and that associated with spending, is that a potential mechanism to increase satisfaction? Then in the second stage, we're actually flipping it on its head. I mean, this is where my own research started back in the day. The idea that we can now take big data as an input to understand something about the psychology of the person that we're studying. So if I observe someone spending, can I make predictions about who that person is, not just in terms of this is person X, but in terms of the underlying psychological traits? And then putting it all together, which for me, honestly, is probably the most interesting part, is saying that can we use predictions of someone's psychological trait from digital footprints to understand who the person is, and then use these insights into, say, the person is more extroverted than the average person, to use these insights to influence behavior and run interventions that are then impacting like a specific outcome, right? So the idea that we can now take personality, individual differences into account at a much larger scale and for the purpose of interventions, because that usually was a pretty limiting factor if you think about personalizing interventions, making interventions more effective by tailoring them to the individual, is that we just couldn't really do that at scale. So that's the focus of the last part, how I see this coming together. I'm going to start with the first one. So this is a paper that was published a while back with David Stilwell and Joe Gladstone. This is like work that I did during my PhD. But essentially, this is how it all started for me in the world of spending. And the question that we asked was essentially, is it the case that people spend more money on products that match their personality? The answer is yes. I'm not going to go into that question in detail. The more interesting question for me was like, does spending money in a way that aligns with your personality, does that lead to increased life satisfaction? And the reason for why this question to me was really interesting is that there was like this entire history of research that was trying to look at the relationships between money and happiness, right? So we all know the saying, money can't buy happiness, but then we oftentimes have an intuition that maybe it actually can. So for a long time, there was this research saying, well, there is a relationship between money and happiness, but only at relatively low levels of income. So if you don't have any money that you can spend, that just makes so many aspects of life harder, and that decreases your happiness. But once you earn a certain amount of household income, around $70,000 a year, it seemed to level out. There's like recent research that also questions that a little bit. But some of the work by Liz Dunn and Mike Norton that I found really inspiring was the idea that, well, maybe if money doesn't buy us happiness, it's because we're not spending it right? So it's not that money, kind of having money, spending money per se, leads to increased happiness, but it's really about how we do it. And what they showed, for example, is that you spend it on others rather than yourself, that increases happiness more. Or if you spend it on experiences rather than material goods, that makes you more happy. But for me as a personality psychologist, the question was like, it's probably not the case that the same types of spending increase happiness for everybody in the same rate, because we have different preferences, we have different motives, we have different needs. So is it the case that if we manage to align our spending with our fundamental psychological traits, that this kind of gets us to lead happier lives? So the way that we did this, and this was a very fortunate collaboration that we got running back in the day, where we teamed up with a bank in the UK, and we managed to survey their customers. So at the end of the day, we sent out the survey to pretty much everybody. At the end of the day, we had 625 bank customers for whom we had a personality assessment and life satisfaction. So we kind of gave them the questionnaire, they filled out the survey. And what we could do with the permission of customers, so they consented to this part, obviously, is that we could connect their survey data to the transactions they had made over the period of 6 months preceding the survey. So now what you could do essentially is to see, okay, who is the person? How do they describe themselves in terms of personality? How happy are they, or how satisfied are they with their lives? And what is it that they spend their money on? So in a really granular way, we could see over the course of these 6 months, what is it that they spend their money on? How much do they spend? And what was helpful in the context of this research is that the transactions already came pre-classified by the bank in 59 categories. So that could be something like entertainment, books. Like oftentimes when you go to your bank account, they already have these labels of here's what you spend your money on. So we capitalized on that. And now the question, as I described before, it was really, if there's a fit between my own personality and the way that I spend my money, does that lead to increased life satisfaction? Which means that there's a couple of things to measure here. One is the personality of the bank customer, right? So, and this is super standard in personality psychology. It's a very short measure, which I should say, if you collaborate with industry, oftentimes there's pretty big trade-offs in terms of what you would like to see as in a questionnaire and what they're willing to send to their customers. So in this case, a short and crude measure and the BFI-10. And then on the flip side, and this is oftentimes much less intuitive to personality psychologists, it's very standard in the context of consumer behavior research, is the question of how do we get at the personality of these spending categories? And the way that we did this in this study here, and there's different ways in which you can actually get to this, is that we asked a separate sample of 200 people, if this spending category was a person, which characteristics would it have? So we showed them, like, here's the spending category entertainment. If this was a person, just think of it as a person, which characteristics would it have? And you can see, so first of all, what's interesting is that there's a lot of consistency, right? If you ask people, what's the personality of entertainment? Like most people have a general sense that this is more extroverted. So the ones that I'm showing you here are entertainment, that's blue, and books in green. And so people think of entertainment as a category that is very extroverted, it's open-minded, it's not so conscientious, which kind of makes a lot of sense. And then if you contrast that to books, books are also open-minded because they're intellectual, but they're a lot more conscientious and a lot more introverted. So they're both nice in terms of reliability because there's a lot of consistency, but also they have a pretty good face validity in that sense. So now we kind of have the component personality of the individual, personality of their spending transactions. Now the question is, how do we calculate fit? And again, there's multiple ways in which you could do that. We've run a whole bunch of robustness checks to see that it's not just one method that we pick in the end, but you can think of personality as a 5-dimensional space, right? I'm only plotting 3 here because you can't really visualize 5-dimensional spaces. But what you can do is you have the personality of the individual, so you can plot that in that space. And now what you can also plot in there are all of the transactions that they made, right? So because you're using the same dimensions, so you can plot that in the same space. And what we would do for the question of this fit actually lead to, do people spend more money on things that match their personality, is we would kind of look at all of these individual transactions and see whether the distance actually makes a difference in terms of how much money they spend. For the second question that I'm more interested in, it was this idea of not so much individual transactions, but what does the overall spending of the person look like? And in order to get to this construct, what we did is we called it the shopping basket, which is really the average across all of the transactions a person has made, right? So if you spend money on travel, on books, on music, we would average them to get a sense of here's the average aggregate personality profile of your spending over the course of these 6 months. And now what you can do simply in that space is essentially calculate distance. So we used Euclidean distance. Again, you can use other metrics to get the same results. But the idea is that we flip it such that fit actually indicates like a higher level of fit. So it's like a shorter distance means that your personality is more closely aligned with the personality of your spending. So looking at the results, so this is, we're now regressing life satisfaction onto this fit measure. And what you see is that there's a significant effect of this fit measure on life satisfaction. What's interesting, and again, this is in line with previous research, is that there's no effect of income on total spend. So it doesn't matter how much money you make, it doesn't matter how much money you spend when it comes to life satisfaction, but this fit seems to matter. And now, because this is an assessment conference, and I do think this is super important to highlight, like you'll see that the effect size is tiny, right? It's really small. And this is something that you often see in big data, and it makes a lot of sense, right? So to some extent, what you capture here is how do your transactions over the course of 6 months, together with your fit in terms of personality, how does it predict your life satisfaction at the end of these 6 months? So all of the biases that you typically get in self-report measures like common method bias, they're not going to play into this because you're essentially measuring life satisfaction and you look at the transactions over the course of these 6 months. So big data is often incredibly noisy. So the fact that we're picking up on any signal in this really noisy data is like a small miracle. And it usually says that the effect that you're finding must be relatively robust for you to be able to pick up on it. And this also brings me to the next point, and to the second study that we published in this paper, is that oftentimes when you compare big data, like the effect sizes that you see when you work with big data, they're much smaller than when you try to replicate the same effect, the same mechanism, the same phenomena in a controlled Matz study. So what we did here, and this was partially because of effect size, mostly because we obviously couldn't say anything about causation because it was like all correlational data. So we followed up with a field experiment, and this is still when I was at Cambridge. So we invited students to the lab. We had pre-screened them. So we gave like a couple of hundred students personality questionnaire. We invited the most extroverted and the most introverted students to the lab. And then before we told them anything about the study, we gave them this baseline happiness questionnaire, in this case the PANA scale, to see how well they're doing before we tell them anything. Then we randomly assigned them to a condition where they received a voucher for the student bar or for like one of the bookstores in Cambridge. And then again, we measured their happiness at 3 different points in time. Immediately once they received the voucher, when they cashed the voucher, so we had briefed the staff in the student bar and in the bookstore to say, if someone comes with this particular voucher, go give them a questionnaire. And then they had to stay in the bar for 30 minutes or read the book for 30 minutes and then complete the questionnaire again. And we collapsed all of this as a measure of post-consumption happiness, right? So now we can compare how does like the post-consumption happiness compare to the pre-consumption as a function of whether they were assigned a matching product or a mismatching product. Oh, and what I should say is like the bar was meant to be an extroverted product and the book was meant to be an introverted product. And so here what you see, let me just walk you through the graph. So you see the change in positive affect on the y-axis. So everything that's above the baseline means that students got happier as a function of their consumption experience. Everything below the baseline means that they got less happy. So if we focus in on the book condition, what you see here is that when introverts were randomly assigned to receive the book voucher, they were on average happier than extroverts, and which is expected because again, like introverts in a matching product condition with the book, they should kind of receive this boost because the purchase now aligns with their personality. What's really kind of funny and interesting is that like when you look at the bar condition, you again see this matching effect. So extroverts were happier than introverts. You also see that the happiness level for introverts actually drops. So if you send these poor introverts to the bar to have fun with their friends, that actually makes them less happy. So poor introverts in this case. But one of the things to note is that the effect size here is much bigger now, right? So we have a super controlled setting where we randomly assign, use questionnaires, we have a very controlled experience of the product. And you see that the effect sizes are much more aligned with what we would hope to see in a regular controlled environment. So that's just a point that I like to make, because I remember when I started in the world of big data, people were saying, oh, it's like all correlational and effect sizes are small. And like my response was always like, nobody prevents you from following up with an experiment to show that it's causal and to kind of test mechanisms and see how it plays out when you have more controlled conditions. So this dichotomy that I think we saw a lot in the beginning of like it's big data versus traditional psychological methods, I think that's gradually breaking down, which is a good thing, because I think there's so many valuable bits and pieces in each of these approaches. Then here's like another study in this context, which I'm mentioning because it kind of showcases a method that I think is kind of gaining traction in the field of psychology, both social psychology and personality psychology, where we look at personality and individual differences, not on the level of a person, but on the level of geographic regions. So in the context of spending, you can imagine that spending is to some extent personal, but it's also a social phenomenon, right? So there's like cultural norms, social expectations, networks. We oftentimes buy stuff that our friends have bought, or like what our culture dictates us to buy. So one of the questions that we had is like, can we think of personality as like the social construct that is influencing our spending, not just through the individual, but through the context? And if you think about it, Lewin, like the idea that behavior is a function of both the person and the environment, the way that psychologists have traditionally tackled this was like the person was the domain of personality psychologists, environment was the domain of social psychologists. And what we are trying to suggest in this paper is that personality can be incredibly useful as a personal variable, but it can also be really insightful and powerful when we think of it as an environmental variable. So the question that we asked here was essentially, does the personality of the consumer's social context, so the personality of other people living in the same environment, does that influence their spending decisions above and beyond their own individual personality? So what we did here is we, again, had access to a pretty large data set of bank transactions, more than 100,000 people in this case, and they were distributed across the UK. So local authority districts are counties in the US. And what we could then match this data with is the BBC data set that was collected by Jason Renfro. It's accessible, it's open for researchers. So if you're interested, you can just Google BBC personality data set and you'll be able to access the data. What that is self-reported personality responses of about 400,000 people in the UK attached to their specific zip code. So you can now say, okay, here's regions in the UK that are more extroverted or more introverted. Here's regions that are more open-minded or less open-minded. And then for a subset, and this is important if we want to compare it to the individual personal level, personality level, is for a subset of these bank customers, we also had survey data on their self-reported personality. So the main data set was just, we only had transactions, but then for a subset, we had transactions plus their self-reported personality. And so now what we did in the first step is we could look at prototypical spending, right? So focusing on this smaller data set, we could see it. What are the spending categories that are most strongly associated with each of the big 5 personality traits? And here's just some examples. Again, some of them have pretty good face validity. Others are like not exactly sure how that works, but we just kind of picked the one that were the most extreme indicators of the personality traits. And now, and to me, this is just, it's like an interesting way of thinking about personality, not just on the level of the individual, but on like a broader regional level. So we're plotting, essentially, it's called a hotspot analysis. It's showing what are some of the regions in the UK that based on people's BBC self-reported personality tests are more extroverted, introverted, higher on openness, low on openness. And you can see the blob in the bottom is London. So London is high on openness, high on extroversion, not so high on conscientiousness and agreeableness. It's like the financial hub of the UK. So that makes a lot of sense, but you can see how personality is distributed regionally. And now if you contrast that to the spending in this region, so now we're zooming out to this big data set of like more than 100,000 people, and we just look at how extroverted is the spending in different regions, you can see that the maps look pretty similar, right? So even if we just looked at the color coding, you would see that there's an overlap between the personality of people in a different data set who live in that region, and then the personality of the spending that we see in this bank transaction data set. But the real question for us was essentially, how do the two work together? So how is our spending a function both of our own personality and the personality of the people around us? And what you see here is essentially that analysis where we kind of put both individual personality and the regional personality of the area that the person lives in into the model to predict spending. And what you can see here is a function of both, right? So individual personality is still a pretty big driver of what people spend their money on. That makes a ton of sense. We've shown this before, but you can also see that across the board, and the personality of the people around you also plays a significant role. So if you are someone who lives in an extroverted part of New York, your chances that you spend your money going to bars, doing social stuff is just higher than someone who lives in a more like reserved part in Brooklyn, also not Village, somewhere else, like in Ohio, in Chicago. So I think for me, this is just a nice way of thinking about measurements that we've typically associated with individuals on a level that kind of captures the environment and captures context. Okay, so we're now kind of transitioning to the second part, which is really flipping it on its head. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because there's a lot of research out there, but it's essentially the idea that can we capture people's individual differences, not by asking them questions, but by observing the behaviors, digital traces that they leave. By now, there's a whole range. When I started, this is it was like in very early stages, and now there's a whole bunch of research out there showing that we can predict your personality from anything that's on your Facebook profile, essentially tweets, faces and pictures, smartphone data, so the GPS records that you create when you have your location data enabled, spending records. So really pretty much any digital footprint that you leave at least holds some kind of signal on who you are as a person. And I'm not going to go into detail of how you build these models, because honestly, at the end of the day, it's not rocket science. It's an extension of what I would say we do in our regression analyses. It's like slightly more complicated, and the way that you evaluate it is different. But it's not something that only computer scientists can do. But what I wanted to show you, and some of you might have seen these already because they're just hilarious, and they're out there for a couple of years now. But this idea, kind of opening the black box of the algorithms and looking at what are some of the underlying relationships between your digital footprints and your personality. So what you see here are the words in people's status updates, and that are most Facebook status updates that are most strongly correlated with extroversion. And again, makes a lot of sense, like parties, weekend, love, amazing. So all of the social stuff that you do with friends and others. And then introverts, like the word cloud looks a lot more reserved and quiet, right? So computer, anime, internet, manga, reading. So those are typically things that you do by yourself. That's my favorite one of all times. You can see high agreeableness has this warm glow. It's like amazing, Thanksgiving, prayers, love. It really has this warm glow to it. Word of warning, the one for low agreeableness, so people are competitive and critical, looks really different. Not cherry picking. Also doesn't mean that if you're low on agreeableness, you swear all the time. It just means that if you happen to swear on Facebook, you're more likely to be disagreeable. Right? And again, all of these just have incredibly high face validity. You can do the same thing for Facebook likes. So those are pages that you can follow. And that's going to become relevant in the third part, because that's one way in which you can actually make these insights useful in the context of interventions. But you, again, has the same picture, introverts, kind of all the things that you do by yourself, and extroverts, pages that are really social. Now, in the context of spending, since this is supposed to be a talk on spending, you can see the same kind of patterns, right? Like highly conscientious people, they spend all their stuff on savings, on treatments, and then you can picture the low conscientious person who's just kind of getting takeout all the time and is snacking away and spending too much money on their smartphone. So again, like pretty good face validity. One of the things that we did in the spending paper, which got me thinking a little bit more about the types of digital footprints that we typically observe and study, was a comparison in terms of the accuracy across different sources. So you have Facebook likes, Facebook status updates. So this is the ones that have the highest predictive validity. And then you can see that spending, pictures, and music, so the things that you listen to, they're kind of like half when it comes to correlations between the predictions and the actual outcomes. And what I think is interesting here, I mean, there's many differences that we see in these sources, but I think one of the distinctions that's theoretically meaningful in the context of psychology is this distinction between identity claims, so like very explicit statements of who you are and how you want to be seen, which you could think of Facebook is a pretty obvious identity claim, right? So you put yourself out there, you like something because that's a statement of who you are. And then behavioral residue, on the other hand, are the much more subtle traces that you leave and you don't even think about it. So spending, oftentimes you don't, to some extent you do, right? If you buy a red leather jacket, you probably have the sense of what you want to do with it and you probably want to stand out. But then a lot of spending is just like, it just happens. The same with music and pictures, I think is somewhere in between. But like this idea of what holds like higher predictive power? Is it identity claims that are curated but like really strong signals of identity, or is it the more subtle behavioral residue? And what you see here is that at least when it comes to self-reports, I think behavioral residues seem to be a little bit weaker. What I do believe is going to be interesting, and there's not that much research out there on this already, is if you think of external validity, right? It could be that identity claims, so Facebook likes and language, they're really good at replicating your self-report, but then maybe your self-report is biased. So as is your behavior and the preferences that you put out there on Facebook. So maybe the behavioral residue, they might not be as good at replicating your self-reports, but maybe they hold some incremental power when we're trying to predict external criteria. That could be life satisfaction, it could be all this other stuff that we would expect the big five to be related to. Okay, and now transitioning into this final part that I mentioned at the beginning, I'm particularly excited about because I think it's really the first time that we can integrate individual differences in these larger interventions, is the combination of the two. And this is work together with Michał Koszynski, Gidinave, and David Stilwell that was published a while back. And it was like focused on the idea of, can we use the insights made from these predictions, right? So if I can predict that you're more extroverted or more introverted, can I use these insights about you to change or influence your behavior in a certain direction? And if you think about this from a consumer behavior perspective, there's like a couple of questions that you can ask, and the two that stand out that I've looked at in the past is essentially the idea of, can we increase the effectiveness of Facebook advertising, either by targeting people with products that match their personalities. So that's very similar to the initial studies that I showed you, where I said, like, if you're an extrovert and you buy extroverted products, you're more satisfied. Or the second part, which this is the one that I'm going to talk about right now, is essentially the idea that maybe it doesn't even have to be the product that we're matching. It's also possible that we take exactly the same product and we're just kind of framing it in two different ways, right? If you think of a lot of products are quite neutral and it's hard to pin down what's their personality. So if you think of a phone, like it's anything, can essentially be whatever you want it to be. Some people want it to socialize with their friends. Some people use it for something totally different because they just play computer games. So the idea was, can we advertise the same product and we just kind of talk about it in different ways that appeal more or less to different types of personalities. And the way that we set this up as a field study was essentially we leveraged the inherent targeting function that comes with Facebook. So everybody on Facebook can run ads. So if you have a Facebook account, you can run ads tomorrow. They're not cheap, but you could do it. And what you can do is you can take the likes, and remember a few slides back, I showed you that there's certain likes that are associated with certain personality traits. So there's socializing, meeting the people associated with extroversion, and then computers, Battlestar Galactica associated with introversion. And what Facebook allows you to do, and this is a screenshot from the Facebook targeting platform, it might look slightly different now, it's a few years back, but essentially what they allow you to do is target people based on certain social demographic characteristics, right? So based on age, gender, location, income. They actually do political ideology in the US, but what they also do is they allow you to target people based on interests. And now what that means is, because we know about these associations between certain interests on Facebook and certain personality traits, what we can tell Facebook essentially is to say, I want you to send my ads to only people who are connected to at least one of these likes. And because I know that the list of likes is associated with extroversion, what I'm technically telling Facebook is, I want you to send my ads to people who have a higher likelihood to be extroverted than the average person, right? And if you kind of take a step back and think about it, this is incredibly prudent. So the way that we're doing this here is we're not taking your entire entire Facebook profile, run it through the algorithm and get a sense of who you are. The only thing that we do is we say, give us a group of people, we don't even know who's in that group, who is connected to at least one of these likes. And because they're connected to at least one of these likes, we assume that they're more extroverted or introverted than other consumers on the platform. And we validated this works, but you could imagine that the effects that we find are like a pretty conservative estimate. So if we were doing a better job at targeting people, you would potentially expect the effects to be bigger. Okay, in this study, we've run this in a couple of different ways. I'm going to just show you one. And we teamed up with a beauty retailer in the UK. So this was an online store. Their goal was to get women, in this case, to click on an ad, go to the store and buy something. So it's essentially what they bought didn't really matter to us. We just wanted them to go to the store and purchase whatever they wanted. And what was really helpful in this case is that we had like an entire creative team to support us. So we told them, look, here's a description of extroversion. Try to come up with 5 ads that are tailored to extroversion, come up with 5 ads that are tailored to introversion. And you see that they did an amazing job, right? That's the beauty of psychology. It's so intuitive because we all have a personality and we can all relate to it. So the extroverted ads, they would always show something social. There were multiple people. The text would say something like dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then the introverted ones would always be like something very reserved and quiet, just one person in front of the mirror. And like beauty doesn't have to shout. So again, the idea that beauty isn't just something that's external, but can also be used in a more internal and introverted way. And then the design, super simple, 2 by 2. So we had the target groups, again, defined by these lists of likes on Facebook, and then the different messages. And the idea was that the matching conditions, so introverts receiving introverted messages, extroverts receiving extroverted messages, that those campaigns will be more effective than the mismatching ones. So let me just walk you through the results. And this was a campaign that was run over the course of 7 days in 2015. The ad was shown more than 6 million times. We got about 10,000 clicks and about 400 conversions, which in this case was a purchase on the beauty retailer's website. And what I should say is that obviously 400 doesn't seem like much. It is quite a lot if you think about the fact that the beauty retailer was really expensive. So in this case, what I'm showing you here is the conversion rate. So that's the number of people that purchased something in relation to how many people saw the ad. And you can replace the graph with return on investment, which is essentially saying how much money did the beauty retailer make, right? So this was a profitable campaign, even though the number of purchases itself might seem relatively low, because it's just that the average purchase amount, I think, was like roughly $60. But what you see, most importantly, is again, this kind of interaction effect. And so the green bars being higher, the matching bars being higher than the mismatching ones, which shows that if you show introverts an introverted message, they're more likely to purchase. And the same is true for extroverts seeing an extroverted message. And again, for me, it's pretty stunning because the targeting is really crude. And the only thing that we tailored was the ad that people saw on Facebook. So once they clicked on the ad, went to the website looked exactly the same for everybody. So it's just kind of by seeing the ad, people must have formed an impression of what the brand is like and whether this is something that is aligned again with their own psychology. Now, one of the things that I'm really excited about, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is research that we've just submitted. It's essentially showing that we can use the same mechanisms, not just to get people to spend more, right? Because that's what we did before in the context of marketing, but also to save more. So the idea that we all oftentimes have a hard time saving, but if we can kind of make certain saving goals more salient to people. So if we say, look, if you save your money right now, you can spend it on this amazing fun trip with your friends in the future, if we're kind of talking to extroverts. And then we can say, if you save some money now, you might be able to make your home a lot more comfortable in the future. And again, this is like now me making stuff up, and you can see I'm not as creative as like the copywriters. So this is a campaign that we ran with a company in the US, and we targeted people who had almost no savings. So people with $100 of savings and less. So those are people who are really struggling, right? And what we find is that if you tailor the message to people's personality, you see a pretty substantial increase in their likelihood of managing to save a certain amount over a certain period of time, which is part of the challenge that the company was running. So it seems to be the case that this is really just tapping into people's motivations, and you can use it to get them to spend more, but you can also use it to get them to save more. And with this, I'm kind of taking you on this journey through these 3 different ways of using data. The point where I want to end, and this is, I think, both an outlook of what I think is going to come in that field, but also like a pretty strong call for ethical implications and us having to think about some of the privacy challenges that come with the use of big data, right? So this is election of the Pope 2005 and 2013, and you can see how it's changed pretty dramatically. So the idea that we now carry these devices with us pretty much 24/7, and what that means is that we can gradually complement these predictions of, here's predictions of personality traits, right? So I take your Facebook profile and I make a prediction that you are extroverted, which is static in a way. We can complement this with these more contextual and situational estimates of, here's an extrovert who's currently in an extroverted situation. What does it do to their self-concept? Maybe now is a good time to target them because they feel extroverted, their self-concept is activated. Maybe now they're the most responsive. But also imagine the opposite. If an extrovert is in a very introverted situation, they lack this stimulation, and now they might be in the most vulnerable state to be kind of persuaded by personality tailored advertising. So I think this idea, and this is like obviously something that I think psychologists have been thinking a lot about, is like the person situation interaction. Like, how can I not just have the snapshot of one person at one time, but how can I integrate the context, all the stuff that I know about the ambience of the person, how can I integrate it into my prediction of who that person is in that moment? If we take this even further, and I'm sure that this is going to come at some point, it's probably just a matter of time. Companies are working on this already, right? Kind of these contact lenses that capture essentially everything that you see 24/7, unless you sleep, so maybe -8 hours. But essentially they capture everything that you see. So they have an insane amount of information about the situation, the context you're in. And they also provide the option of then, again, giving content back to you that's personalized. So if we think about like echo chambers in the context of Facebook, of like, oh, you just see the stuff that you're interested in anyway. Like once we have these contact lenses that have a pretty good understanding of what it is that we're doing, who we are, and then give us the information that's specifically tailored to us and specifically tailored to the context, there's a pretty good chance that my reality might look entirely different to the reality of the people around us. So I think this is just something for psychologists that could be really interesting in terms of a tool, pretty creepy and terrifying when you think of it in terms of the broader societal implications. And with that, I'm done, and I'm super happy to answer questions and stuff.